Marcus had been hauling freight across America's highways for 23 years when he picked up a load in Nevada that would make him hang up his keys forever. What started as a routine cross-country run turned into a nightmare that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about the roads he'd traveled thousands of times. The interstate system isn't just 48,000 miles of asphalt connecting cities. It's a web of shadows where the rules of normal society break down completely, where predators, both human and otherwise, move freely between jurisdictions in the dead of night, and where a driver's greatest enemy isn't mechanical failure or bad weather. It's the realization that some things following you in your mirrors aren't supposed to exist at all. Tonight, I'm sharing 12 of the most disturbing encounters ever reported by long-haul truckers. Stories so terrifying that veteran drivers with decades of experience refuse to take certain routes anymore. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are documented accounts from professional drivers who've seen things that will make you think twice about every late-night road trip you've ever taken. Welcome to Untold Fears. If these stories gave you chills, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because every week I bring you the most terrifying true stories that most people never hear about. Drop a comment below if you've ever experienced something unexplained on the road, and don't forget to like this video if you want to see more trucker horror stories that will keep you awake at night. Jake Morrison had been pulling 18-wheelers across America's highways for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never encountered anything on the road that truly scared him 12. He'd survived ice storms in Montana, dust storms in Arizona, and more close calls with four-wheelers than he cared to count. But nothing had prepared him for what happened on Interstate 80 through Wyoming during the early morning hours of March 15th, 2023. Jake was hauling a load of electronics from California to Chicago, running his usual route that took him through the desolate stretches of Wyoming where the nearest town could be 50 miles in any direction. The weather had been clear when he'd stopped for fuel in Rock Springs, but by the time he reached the Lincoln County stretch, a thick fog had rolled in that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet ahead of his headlights. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, Jake's CB radio crackled to life with a voice he'd never heard before. The transmission was crystal clear, which was unusual given the atmospheric conditions that typically interfered with radio signals. Eastbound Kenworth at mile marker 142, you've got a situation developing ahead. The voice said in a calm, professional tone that marked the speaker as an experienced driver. Jake glanced at his mile marker indicator and felt a chill run down his spine. He was currently passing mile marker 141. The stranger continued. Heavy fog's got a multi-vehicle accident blocking both lanes about 5 miles ahead. You're going to want to take the next exit and use the old highway to bypass it. Jake keyed his radio and responded, "Thanks for the heads up, good buddy. What's your 20? The reply came back immediately. "I'm about a mile behind you, just trying to help a fellow driver avoid some trouble." Jake found the next exit and took the stranger's advice, pulling off onto what appeared to be an older state highway that ran parallel to the interstate. The fog seemed even thicker on this secondary road, and his GPS immediately began acting erratically, showing his position as being several miles away from where he actually was. The CB continued to crackle with updates from his mysterious helper. "You're doing good, driver. Stay on this road for about 12 miles, and you'll see signs for getting back on the interstate." The voice was reassuring, but there was something about it that began to bother Jake. A slight echo, as if the person was speaking from inside a tunnel or a large, empty space. "What kind of rig are you driving?" Jake asked, trying to make conversation. "Blue Peterbilt 379, Classic model from the 80s. She's been good to me for a lot of years." Jake smiled at that. He'd driven a Pete 379 early in his career and had fond memories of that truck. As Jake continued down the isolated highway, he began to notice that the landscape didn't match what he remembered from previous trips through this area. The road seemed to wind more than it should have, and the few structures he could make out in the fog looked abandoned and weathered in a way that suggested they'd been empty for decades. His CB companion continued to provide updates and directions, but Jake was starting to feel increasingly uneasy. "How long have you been driving this route?" he asked during one of their exchanges. "Oh, I've been running these roads for about 23 years now," came the reply. "Started back in 2001, been hauling everything from produce to heavy machinery. You get to know every mile marker, every truck stop, every shortcut." The math troubled Jake. If the man had started driving in 2001, that would make it more than 23 years. Not exactly 23. After nearly an hour of driving through the fog on increasingly unfamiliar roads, Jake began to suspect that something was seriously wrong. His fuel gauge hadn't moved despite the extended detour, and his odometer seemed to be advancing much more slowly than it should have been. Most disturbing of all, when he tried to call his dispatcher on his cell phone, he discovered that he had no signal whatsoever, not even emergency service availability. The CB radio, however, continued to work perfectly, and his mysterious guide seemed to anticipate his every question and concern. "Don't worry about the cell service," the voice said without being asked. "These old highways have dead zones that stretch for miles. You'll get your signal back once we get you reconnected to the main route." Jake was beginning to wonder how the stranger could know what he was thinking before he even keyed his radio to ask. The breakthrough came when Jake finally thought to ask a question that had been nagging at him since the conversation began. "What's your name, driver? I like to know who I'm talking to on the radio." There was a long pause before the answer came, and when it did, Jake's blood ran cold. "Name's Robert Chen. Most folks on the road called me China Bob." Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel as memories flooded back. Robert Chen had been a legendary figure among long-haul truckers, known for his encyclopedic knowledge of American highways and his willingness to help other drivers in trouble. Jake had heard dozens of stories about China Bob over the years, and he'd always regretted never meeting the man in person. The problem was that Robert Chen had died in a truck accident on this very stretch of Wyoming highway in 2018, a fact that Jake knew because he'd attended the memorial service at a truck stop in Cheyenne. "Bob," Jake said carefully, "what year do you think it is?" The reply came without hesitation. "It's 2018, March 15th. "Why do you ask?" Jake's hands were shaking now as he realized the full implications of what was happening. According to his own truck's computer, it was 2023, not 2018. And March 15th, 2018, was the exact date that Robert Chen had died in a collision with a drunk driver who'd been traveling westbound in the eastbound lanes during a heavy fog. "Bob," Jake said, his voice barely steady, "I need you to listen to me carefully. You need to pull over right now. There's a wrong-way driver ahead of you, and you're about to—" The CB radio erupted with static, then went completely silent. Jake found himself alone on the dark highway, surrounded by fog so thick that he couldn't see beyond his own headlights. His GPS suddenly sprang back to life, showing his correct position and indicating that he was still on a legitimate state highway that would indeed reconnect him to Interstate 80. But when he tried to raise China Bob on the radio, there was no response. Over the next several minutes, Jake began to encounter other eastbound truckers who confirmed that there had indeed been a multi-vehicle accident on the main interstate, exactly as Bob had warned him. When Jake asked if any of them had seen a blue Peterbilt 379 on the highway, they all reported the same thing. They'd heard someone giving directions and traffic updates on the CB, but they'd never actually seen another truck. Jake completed his delivery to Chicago without further incident, but the experience left him deeply shaken. He spent the following weeks researching the accident that had killed Robert Chen, and what he discovered made him question everything he thought he understood about the nature of reality. According to the official reports, Chen had been traveling eastbound on Interstate 80 when he encountered a drunk driver in the wrong lanes. The accident had occurred at approximately 3:45 a.m. during heavy fog conditions. Chen had been heard on CB radio warning other drivers about dangerous conditions right up until the moment of impact. Several truckers had reported hearing him give detailed directions for alternate routes, potentially saving dozens of lives. The final transmission from Chen's radio, according to witness accounts, had been a warning about a wrong-way driver. A warning that came too late to save his own life. Jake eventually learned that his experience was not unique. Over the years since Chen's death, more than a dozen truckers had reported similar encounters with a helpful voice on CB radio during dangerous weather conditions in Wyoming. The voice always identified itself as Robert Chen, always provided accurate warnings about road hazards, and always seemed to know exactly where each driver was located. Most disturbing of all, the encounters typically occurred on or around March 15th, the anniversary of Chen's death. Jake realized that he had been helped by someone who was continuing to do in death what he had done in life, protecting other drivers from the dangers of the road. The experience changed Jake's understanding of the highways he traveled, making him aware that the roads carried more than just cargo and commerce. They carried the spirits of those who had dedicated their lives to the endless miles. And sometimes, those spirits continued their work long after their earthly journey had ended. Sarah Martinez had been an owner-operator for 12 years, running her own freightliner Cascadia across the western states with a precision that had earned her a reputation among freight brokers for never missing a delivery deadline. She specialized in time-sensitive loads that other drivers wouldn't touch. Electronics that needed to reach their destination within narrow windows, medical supplies that couldn't afford delays, and high-value cargo that required both speed and security. On the night of September 3rd, 2023, Sarah was hauling a load of computer servers from Seattle to Denver, running ahead of schedule as always, when she decided to take a break at what appeared to be a standard truck stop along Interstate 90 in the remote stretches of Montana. The decision would trap her in a nightmare that challenged everything she thought she knew about the physical world. Sarah had been driving for nearly 11 hours straight, pushing the limits of her logbook, but staying within legal parameters thanks to her split sleeper berth strategy. The digital clock on her dashboard read 2:17 a.m. when she spotted the familiar glow of a truck stop's lights cutting through the darkness ahead. The facility appeared to be a standard travel center. Fuel islands, a convenience store, and a parking area large enough for several dozen trucks. What caught her attention was how well-maintained everything looked despite the remote location. The pavement was freshly paved, the lighting was bright and modern, and the building itself had that clean, corporate appearance of a major chain truck stop. Sarah pulled into the fuel island and began the routine of topping off her tanks, checking her oil, and performing the walk-around inspection that was second nature after more than a decade on the road. As she was fueling, Sarah noticed that despite the late hour, the truck stop seemed unusually busy. There were at least 20 other trucks parked in the lot, their drivers presumably sleeping or taking their mandatory rest breaks. What struck her as odd was the variety of equipment. She saw everything from modern Peterbilts and Kenworths to older models that looked like they'd been well maintained but were clearly from previous decades. There was even what appeared to be a classic Mack from the 1980s, its chrome bumper gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Sarah appreciated vintage trucks, but it was unusual to see so many of them in one location, especially given the maintenance costs and regulatory challenges of keeping older equipment on the road. After fueling, Sarah decided to grab a coffee and a snack from the convenience store before finding a parking spot for her 10-hour break. The store was surprisingly well stocked for such a remote location, with hot food options, a wide selection of trucking supplies, and even a small dining area with booths where drivers could sit and eat. Behind the counter was a clerk who looked to be in his 50s, wearing a name tag that read, Frank. He greeted Sarah with the kind of professional friendliness that suggested he'd been working truck stops for years. "Evening, driver. How's the road treating you tonight?" Frank asked as he rang up her coffee and a sandwich. "Can't complain," Sarah replied. "This is a nice facility you've got here. I don't remember seeing it on this route before." Frank's smile seemed to falter slightly. "We've been here for a while," he said. "Folks sometimes don't notice us until they really need us." Sarah found a parking spot near the back of the lot and climbed into her sleeper berth, setting her alarm for 12:30 p.m. to give herself a full 10 hours of rest. She'd been asleep for what felt like several hours when she was awakened by the sound of voices outside her truck. Checking her phone, she was surprised to see that it was only 3:45 a.m. She'd been asleep for barely an hour and a half, but she felt like she'd been out for much longer. The voices belonged to a group of drivers who were standing near a classic Peterbilt 359, engaged in what sounded like a heated discussion about routes and delivery schedules. What bothered Sarah was that their conversation seemed to reference cities and highways using names she didn't recognize, despite her extensive knowledge of the American road system. Unable to get back to sleep, Sarah decided to get up and walk around the facility to stretch her legs. The truck stop seemed different in the pre-dawn darkness. The layout appeared to have changed somehow, with the fuel islands positioned differently than she remembered. The convenience store was still open, but when she walked inside, she noticed that the merchandise had been rearranged. Products that had been on the left side of the store were now on the right, and the coffee station had moved to an entirely different location. Most unsettling of all, Frank was still behind the counter, wearing the same clothes and offering the same professional smile as if no time had passed at all. "Back already?" he asked. "Sometimes drivers have trouble sleeping here. The altitude can affect some people." Sarah knew that the elevation in this part of Montana wasn't high enough to cause altitude-related sleep issues, but she didn't argue with the man. As Sarah walked back toward her truck, she encountered another driver, a woman in her 40s wearing a Caterpillar hat and a worn denim jacket. "First time at this place?" the woman asked, extending her hand in greeting. "I'm Janet. Been driving for 18 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this stop." Sarah shook her hand and introduced herself, then asked what Janet meant by her comment. "Well," Janet said, glancing around nervously, "I pulled in here about 6 hours ago for a quick fuel stop. Was planning to be back on the road in 30 minutes. But every time I try to leave, something happens. First, my truck wouldn't start. Engine would turn over but wouldn't catch. Then when I finally got it running, the exit seemed to lead me right back into the parking lot. I've tried leaving 4 different times, and I keep ending up right back here." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana night air. "Have you talked to anyone else about this?" she asked. Janet nodded toward a cluster of trucks near the building. "There's about a dozen of us having the same problem. Some of these guys have been here for days, according to what they're telling me. But here's the really weird part. None of us are getting hungry or tired like we should be. It's like time isn't moving the same way here." Sarah looked at her phone and was shocked to see that it was still showing 3:45 a.m., the same time she'd checked it nearly an hour ago. The digital clock on the truck stop sign displayed the same time, frozen as if someone had stopped all the clocks in the facility simultaneously. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah walked over to the group of drivers that Janet had mentioned. They were a mix of men and women, ranging in age from their 30s to their 60s, all wearing the practical clothing of professional truckers. Each of them had a similar story. They'd stopped at the facility for routine purposes and found themselves unable to leave. Some reported that their trucks would start, but the exit roads would somehow loop back to the parking lot. Others said their vehicles would develop mechanical problems that prevented departure, only to have those problems mysteriously resolve themselves when they weren't actively trying to leave. One driver, a grizzled veteran named Pete, who claimed to have been stuck there for 3 days, told Sarah that the facility seemed to change its layout every few hours, with buildings moving, parking spaces reconfiguring, and even the number of fuel islands varying from visit to visit. Sarah decided to test their claims by attempting to leave herself. She started her Freightliner and pulled out of her parking space, following the clearly marked exit signs toward the highway. The road seemed normal at first, but as she drove what should have been a straight path back to Interstate 90, she found herself driving in a wide circle that brought her right back to the truck stop entrance. She tried again, this time taking a different route and carefully watching her GPS for guidance. The GPS screen showed her moving in a straight line away from the facility, but her physical location remained unchanged. She was still circling back to the same parking lot. On her third attempt, she noticed something that made her question her own sanity. The facility's buildings had rearranged themselves while she was driving, with the convenience store now positioned where the maintenance building had been, and the fuel islands rotated 90 degrees from. The most disturbing discovery came when Sarah checked her logbook and compared it to her truck's electronic monitoring system. According to every timepiece in her possession, she had been at the facility for less than 2 hours, but her truck's engine computer showed that she'd been idling for more than 14 hours. The fuel gauge, which had been nearly full when she arrived, now showed less than a quarter tank, despite the fact that she'd topped off her tanks and hadn't driven more than a few miles in circles around the facility. Her cell phone showed no signal, but more troubling was the fact that her satellite communication system, which was supposed to work anywhere in North America, was completely offline. She was cut off from the outside world in a way that shouldn't have been possible with modern technology. As dawn should have been breaking, Sarah realized that the sky remained locked in the same pre-dawn darkness that had greeted her hours earlier. The other trapped drivers had formed an informal support group, sharing food and information as they tried to make sense of their situation. Some had begun to suspect that the facility existed in some kind of temporal pocket, disconnected from the normal flow of time and space. Others theorized that they had somehow driven into a parallel dimension where the normal rules of physics didn't apply. What they all agreed on was that the truck stop was more than just a rest facility. It was a trap designed to capture travelers who were unfortunate enough to discover it during their journey across the lonely highways of America. Sarah's understanding of reality had been fundamentally altered by her experience at the Infinite Rest Stop. She learned that the American highway system contained spaces that existed outside the normal world. Places where the laws of physics bent and twisted in ways that defied explanation. The road had become something more than a means of transportation. It had become a gateway to experiences that challenged the very foundations of what drivers thought they knew about the world they traveled through each day. Tommy Rodriguez had been running team operations for 8 years, splitting driving duties with his partner Carlos on long-haul routes that kept them moving around the clock. They specialized in expedited freight that couldn't afford the delays of single-driver operations. And their 2019 Peterbilt 579 had logged over 800,000 miles without a single missed delivery. Tommy was the night driver, preferring the quiet roads and lighter traffic that came with the darkness, while Carlos handled the daylight hours when the highways were crowded with four-wheelers and construction zones. On the night of October 12th, 2023, Tommy was piloting their rig westbound on Interstate 40 through the remote stretches of New Mexico, hauling a load of automotive parts from Detroit to Phoenix, when he first noticed the headlights in his mirrors that would haunt him for the next 300 miles. The shift change had occurred at a truck stop in Amarillo, Texas, where Carlos had crawled into the sleeper berth for his mandatory 10-hour break while Tommy took control of the wheel. The weather was clear, with a new moon that left the desert landscape in almost complete darkness beyond the reach of his headlights. Tommy appreciated these conditions. The lack of ambient light meant he could see the glow of approaching traffic from miles away, and the empty roads allowed him to maintain a steady cruise speed that maximized fuel efficiency. At 11:47 p.m., he was making excellent time as he crossed into New Mexico, running ahead of schedule and looking forward to an easy night of driving through sparsely populated desert terrain. It was just after midnight when Tommy first noticed the distinctive pattern of headlights in his driver's side mirror. The lights belonged to what appeared to be another 18-wheeler, running about a quarter-mile behind him and maintaining a consistent distance. What caught Tommy's attention was how the headlights seemed unusually bright. Not the typical halogen or LED lights that most trucks used, but something that cast a harsh white light that seemed to cut through the darkness with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable to look at directly. Tommy initially assumed it was another expedited freight hauler running a similar schedule. But as the minutes passed, he began to notice that the following truck never seemed to gain or lose ground, maintaining exactly the same distance regardless of Tommy's speed. Tommy decided to test his theory by gradually increasing his speed from 65 to 70 miles per hour, a change that should have caused a following vehicle to either fall behind or close the gap. The headlights in his mirror remained at exactly the same distance, as if the other truck had matched his speed increase perfectly. Tommy then reduced his speed to 60 miles per hour, expecting to see the other truck either pass him or pull in behind him at a closer distance. Again, the headlights maintained their exact position, never wavering from their quarter-mile following distance. Tommy reached for his CB radio and keyed the microphone. "Westbound truck about a quarter-mile behind the Pete 579 at mile marker 312, you copy?" The radio remained silent, except for the occasional static burst of distant conversations from other drivers hundreds of miles away. As Tommy continued driving, he began to notice other unusual characteristics of his mysterious follower. The headlights never seemed to dim or brighten in response to oncoming traffic, which was standard practice among professional drivers to avoid blinding other motorists. More disturbing was the fact that the lights never showed the slight variations in height and angle that would be expected from a truck traveling over the natural rise and fall of the highway. The headlights remained perfectly level and steady, as if they were floating at a fixed height above the road surface. Tommy tried using his high beams to get a better look at the truck in his mirrors, but the angle and distance made it impossible to make out any details beyond the hypnotic glow of those unnaturally bright headlights. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came when Tommy encountered a construction zone that required him to merge into the left lane. As he activated his turn signal and began to move over, he glanced in his mirror to check the position of the following truck. What he saw made his blood run cold. The headlights were no longer behind him. Instead, they were positioned directly alongside him in the right lane, maintaining the same quarter-mile distance, but now running parallel to his position. Tommy looked out his passenger window and saw nothing but empty highway. Yet his mirrors clearly showed the headlights keeping pace with him in the lane he'd just vacated. He completed the lane change and continued through the construction zone, but the headlights remained in his mirrors, impossibly positioned where no truck should have been able to maintain that speed and distance. After clearing the construction zone, Tommy tried to catch up to the mysterious truck by accelerating to 75 miles per hour. Well above the posted speed limit, but within the range that most enforcement officers would tolerate. The headlights in his mirror remained at their exact distance, suggesting that the other truck had matched his speed increase, despite the fact that Tommy was now traveling faster than most commercial vehicles could legally or safely maintain. Tommy activated his hazard lights and began to slow down, thinking that perhaps he could force the other truck to pass him and finally get a clear look at the vehicle that had been following him for over an hour. As his speed dropped to 45 miles per hour, the headlights maintained their position, apparently content to crawl along the highway at whatever speed Tommy chose to maintain. The situation became even more disturbing when Tommy realized that his mysterious follower was having impossible interactions with other traffic. When an eastbound truck passed in the opposite direction, Tommy watched in his mirror as the other truck's headlights briefly illuminated what should have been the cab and trailer of his follower. Instead of the expected silhouette of a tractor-trailer, Tommy saw nothing but empty road bathed in the glow of those persistent headlights. The eastbound truck continued on its way without any sign that the driver had noticed anything unusual, despite the fact that the headlights were clearly visible in Tommy's mirrors. Tommy tried using his CB radio to contact the eastbound driver, but received no response to his increasingly frantic calls. Tommy's partner, Carlos, woke up around 2:30 a.m., stirring in the sleeper berth as he prepared to take over driving duties at their next scheduled stop. "How's it going out there?" Carlos asked, climbing into the passenger seat to keep Tommy company during the final hours of his shift. "We've got company?" Tommy replied, nodding toward the mirrors. "There's been a truck following us for the past 2.5 hours, maintaining the exact same distance no matter what I do." Carlos looked in the mirrors and confirmed that he could see the headlights. But when he leaned forward to look out the back window of the sleeper berth, he reported seeing nothing but empty highway. "Maybe it's just the angle," Carlos suggested. But Tommy could hear the uncertainty in his partner's voice. The pair decided to stop at the next truck stop to fuel up and see if their mysterious follower would reveal itself. As they pulled into the Flying J at mile marker 277, Tommy watched his mirrors carefully to see what the other truck would do. The headlights followed them into the truck stop, but instead of pulling into a parking space or fuel lane, they simply stopped at the entrance to the facility and remained there, casting their harsh white light across the empty asphalt. Tommy and Carlos completed their fuel stop and walked around the facility, looking for any sign of the truck that had been following them. They found nothing. No vehicle that matched the headlights they'd been seeing, no driver who admitted to following them, and no explanation for the lights that were still visible from the truck stop entrance. When Tommy and Carlos returned to their truck and prepared to leave, the headlights were still waiting at the entrance. As they pulled back onto Interstate 40, their mysterious follower resumed its position exactly a quarter-mile behind them, as if it had never stopped at all. Carlos took over driving duties at that point. But the headlights continued to follow them for another 50 miles before finally disappearing just as suddenly as they had appeared. Tommy spent the rest of the night in the sleeper berth, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched by something that existed just beyond the edge of normal perception. The experience left Tommy with a profound sense of unease about the highways he'd traveled safely for years. He began to research similar encounters and discovered that the phenomenon of phantom trucks was more common than he'd ever imagined. Other drivers reported being followed by vehicles that cast no shadows, left no tire tracks, and seemed to exist only in mirrors and peripheral vision. Some described the headlights as having an hypnotic quality that made it difficult to look away, while others reported that the phantom vehicles would disappear when approached directly, but reappear as soon as the observer's attention shifted elsewhere. Tommy learned that the highways carried more than just commercial traffic. They were home to entities that moved through the darkness with purposes that living drivers could never fully understand. Miguel Vasquez had been running freight as an independent hauler for 20 years, building a reputation for taking loads that other drivers wouldn't touch. Oversized cargo that required special permits, hazmat shipments that came with strict safety protocols, and time-sensitive deliveries that demanded precise scheduling. His 2015 Volvo VNL 780 had been customized with every piece of equipment he needed to handle specialized freight, from extra lighting systems to reinforced tie-down points that could secure the most challenging loads. Miguel prided himself on never turning down a job, no matter how unusual the requirements might be. On the morning of November 8th, 2023, Miguel received a call about a pickup in rural East Texas that would test his professional confidence and ultimately change his understanding of what kind of cargo could be loaded onto a trailer. The call came in at 4:30 a.m. from a freight broker named Peterson, who specialized in connecting independent drivers with high-paying loads that major carriers wouldn't handle. "Miguel, I've got something that's perfect for you," Peterson said, his voice carrying the kind of excitement that usually meant either a very lucrative haul or a very difficult one. "It's a pickup in rural Texas, near a town called Carthage. The shipper is paying premium rates, $3 per mile for what they're calling specialized medical equipment. It's going to a research facility in Colorado, and they need it there within 48 hours. Miguel calculated the distance and timeline in his head. Approximately 650 miles from East Texas to Colorado, well within his capability to deliver on schedule. The rate was nearly double what he'd normally expect for a load of that distance, which meant either the cargo was extremely valuable or there were complications that the shipper hadn't disclosed. Miguel arrived at the pickup location just as the sun was beginning to rise over the pine forests of East Texas. The address led him to what appeared to be a private research facility, a series of low concrete buildings surrounded by high fencing and security cameras. The facility had no visible signage identifying its purpose or ownership, which was unusual but not unprecedented in Miguel's experience with government and medical shipments. A security guard directed him to a loading dock, where two technicians in white lab coats were waiting beside a refrigerated trailer that was already loaded and sealed. The trailer was a standard 53-foot reefer unit, but Miguel noticed that it was equipped with additional power cables and monitoring equipment that he'd never seen on medical shipments before. The paperwork was minimal. just a bill of lading that listed the cargo as biological research materials, with a destination address in Denver. What concerned Miguel was the unusual number of restrictions and special handling requirements. The trailer was to remain sealed at all times, with no inspections allowed during transport. The refrigeration unit was to be maintained at exactly minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with no deviation allowed. Most unusual of all, the trailer was equipped with a satellite monitoring system that would track not just location and temperature, but also any vibrations or movements within the cargo area. This is some pretty serious equipment for medical supplies, Miguel commented to one of the technicians. The man simply nodded and handed Miguel a sealed envelope containing additional instructions that were not to be opened until he was at least 100 miles from the facility. Miguel completed his pre-trip inspection and departed the facility with his mysterious cargo, initially feeling confident about what appeared to be a straightforward refrigerated haul. The trailer was properly balanced, the refrigeration unit was operating normally, and his route to Colorado was clear of any weather concerns. It wasn't until he was about 50 miles down the highway that he began to notice the first signs that something was wrong with his load. The trailer seemed to be handling differently than he'd expected, not heavier or lighter than the paperwork indicated, but somehow less stable, as if the cargo was shifting despite being properly secured. Miguel checked his mirrors and confirmed that the trailer was tracking straight, but he could feel a subtle vibration through the tractor that suggested movement in the cargo area. When Miguel reached the 100-mile mark, he pulled into a truck stop and opened the sealed envelope of additional instructions. What he read made his blood run cold. The cargo was not medical equipment at all, but rather specimens from what the paperwork described as Project Nightfall, a research program that studied anomalous biological entities discovered in remote locations. The instructions warned that the specimens were to be kept frozen at all times, as warming could cause them to resume activity. Most disturbing of all, the instructions included an emergency contact number and warned that if the refrigeration unit failed, Miguel was to abandon the trailer immediately and call for a specialized cleanup crew. The envelope also contained a hazmat bonus payment of $5,000, suggesting that the shipper had been less than honest about the true nature of the cargo. Miguel's first instinct was to return to the facility and refuse the load. But he was already committed to the delivery, and the substantial payment would solve several pressing financial problems. He decided to continue with the haul, but to monitor the cargo more carefully than usual. Over the next several hours, the vibrations in the trailer seemed to increase, and Miguel began to hear sounds that were difficult to explain. Scraping noises, as if something was moving against the trailer walls, and occasional thuds that sounded like heavy objects shifting despite the fact that the load should have been frozen solid. The refrigeration unit was working perfectly, maintaining the required temperature with no fluctuations. But the sounds from the trailer continued to grow more pronounced. As afternoon turned to evening, Miguel noticed that the temperature readings on his dashboard were showing some unusual patterns. While the refrigeration unit was maintaining minus 20 degrees in the cargo area, the ambient temperature around the trailer seemed to be dropping significantly. Other drivers at fuel stops commented on the unusual cold that seemed to radiate from his trailer, and Miguel himself noticed that ice was forming on the outside of the trailer walls, despite the fact that the outside temperature was well above freezing. The phenomenon was impossible according to the laws of thermodynamics. Heat should have been flowing from the warmer outside air into the colder trailer, not the other way around. The situation became truly terrifying when Miguel stopped for fuel in New Mexico just after sunset. As he was pumping diesel, he heard what sounded like voices coming from inside the trailer, not human voices, but something that seemed to be attempting to mimic human speech. The sounds were muffled by the insulation and aluminum walls, but they were unmistakably vocal, with rising and falling tones that suggested communication or perhaps distress. Miguel walked around the trailer, listening carefully, and confirmed that the sounds were definitely coming from inside the cargo area. When he pressed his ear against the trailer wall, he could hear what sounded like dozens of voices, all speaking in languages he didn't recognize, creating a cacophony of alien sounds that made his skin crawl. Miguel called the emergency number from the instruction envelope and was connected to a technician who identified himself only as Dr. Morrison. When Miguel described the sounds and temperature anomalies, Dr. Morrison's response was immediate and urgent. "You need to get that trailer to the destination facility as quickly as possible," the doctor said. "Under no circumstances should you open the trailer or allow anyone else to inspect the cargo. The specimens are showing signs of activity that we didn't anticipate, and they need to be transferred to a more secure containment facility immediately." Miguel asked what exactly he was hauling, but Dr. Morrison would only say that the cargo consisted of biological materials recovered from locations that don't officially exist. The final 200 miles to Denver were the longest of Miguel's career. The sounds from the trailer grew more intense and organized, as if whatever was inside was becoming more active and aware. The temperature anomalies worsened, with ice forming on the trailer so thick that other drivers began pointing and taking pictures. Most disturbing of all, Miguel began to hear his own name being called from inside the trailer, not in his own voice, but in the voices of people he'd known throughout his life. He heard his mother calling him for dinner, his ex-wife asking him to come home, and his deceased father offering advice about trucking routes. The voices were perfect replications, but they were coming from creatures that had somehow learned to mimic human speech patterns with terrifying accuracy. Miguel delivered the trailer to the research facility in Colorado without opening it or allowing anyone else to inspect the cargo. But the experience fundamentally changed his approach to freight hauling. He learned that the American transportation system was used to move more than just commercial goods. It was a network for transferring materials and entities that existed at the edges of human understanding. The highways carried secrets that most drivers never suspected. And sometimes those secrets were alive, aware, and waiting for the right moment to escape from the trailers that held them. Miguel never took another load from Peterson, and he made sure to thoroughly research every shipper before accepting their freight. The road had taught him that some cargo was too dangerous to haul, regardless of how much money was offered for the delivery. Rebecca Walsh had been a long-haul specialist for 10 years, preferring the solitude of cross-country routes that kept her away from the congested freight corridors of the East Coast. Her 2020 Freightliner Cascadia was equipped with the latest navigation technology and efficiency monitoring systems, tools that helped her maintain the precise fuel economy and delivery schedules that had made her one of the most sought-after independent contractors in the upper Midwest. Rebecca specialized in high-value electronics shipments that required both security consciousness and time-sensitive delivery windows, often running loads that other drivers found too stressful or demanding. On the morning of December 14th, 2023, Rebecca was hauling a load of server equipment from Minneapolis to Portland, running her usual route on Interstate 90 through the endless prairie landscapes of South Dakota, when she encountered a phenomenon that would trap her in a nightmare loop of repeating reality. Rebecca had departed Minneapolis at 6 p.m. the previous evening, timing her departure to put her in the empty stretches of South Dakota during the pre-dawn hours when traffic was lightest and fuel efficiency was at its peak. She'd been driving for nearly 10 hours, making excellent time across the frozen landscape, when she found herself approaching a section of highway that she'd traveled hundreds of times before. The stretch between Mitchell and Chamberlain was a straight, flat run of about 60 miles that drivers often used as a benchmark for their overall trip progress. Rebecca knew every mile marker, every overpass, and every landmark along this section of road. At exactly 4:03 a.m., she passed mile marker 248, noting that she was running about 30 minutes ahead of schedule, and her fuel consumption was tracking perfectly for the trip. The first sign that something was wrong came when Rebecca noticed that her fuel gauge hadn't moved in what felt like an hour of driving. She'd been monitoring her fuel consumption carefully, as she always did, and knew that she should have used approximately 15 gallons since her last fuel stop in Mitchell. The gauge, however, showed exactly the same level it had displayed when she'd passed mile marker 248. Rebecca initially attributed this to a possible sensor malfunction, but her truck's advanced monitoring system showed no error codes, and all other systems were functioning normally. More puzzling was the fact that her odometer seemed to be advancing much more slowly than it should have been, despite the fact that her speedometer showed a steady 65 miles per hour. Rebecca began to pay closer attention to the landmarks around her, using the technique that veteran drivers employed to track their progress when electronic systems failed. She noted a distinctive farmhouse with a red barn, a water tower with Reliance painted on its side, and a billboard advertising a casino in Deadwood. These landmarks were familiar to her, and she used them to confirm her position on the highway. 20 minutes later, she was startled to see the same farmhouse, water tower, and billboard appearing in her headlights again, in exactly the same sequence and with the same spacing between them. Rebecca checked her GPS and confirmed that she was still heading west on Interstate 90. But the repeated landmark suggested that she was somehow driving in a circle, despite the fact that the highway was perfectly straight. Determined to solve the mystery, Rebecca began to pay meticulous attention to every detail of her surroundings. She noted the exact time when she passed each landmark, the precise mileage reading on her odometer, and the fuel level displayed on her gauge. At 4:31 a.m., she passed mile marker 248 again, with her fuel gauge showing exactly the same level and her odometer reading exactly the same mileage as it had nearly 30 minutes earlier. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was somehow reliving the same stretch of highway over and over again, trapped in a loop that reset itself every time she reached a certain point on the road. Rebecca tried using her CB radio to contact other drivers, but the airwaves were strangely quiet for a major interstate corridor. She attempted to call her dispatcher on her cell phone, but discovered that she had no signal despite being in an area where she'd never had connectivity problems before. Her satellite communication system, which was designed to work anywhere in North America, showed no available satellites. Most disturbing of all, her GPS continued to show her making normal progress westward. But the physical evidence of her surroundings proved that she was covering the same ground repeatedly. The electronic systems in her truck seemed to be unaware of the temporal anomaly that had trapped her. As Rebecca continued to loop through the same section of highway, she began to notice subtle changes in her environment that suggested the phenomenon was more complex than a simple repetition. The weather conditions shifted slightly with each loop. Sometimes the sky was clear, sometimes there was a light snowfall, and occasionally fog would roll across the prairie. The traffic patterns changed as well, with different vehicles appearing and disappearing at various points along the route. During one loop, she encountered a convoy of military vehicles that hadn't been there before. During another, She saw a classic car show parked at a rest area that had been empty during previous cycles. These variations suggested that she wasn't simply repeating the same moment in time, but rather cycling through different versions of the same stretch of highway. The psychological impact of the time loop began to wear on Rebecca after the first dozen cycles. She experimented with different approaches to breaking free from the pattern, trying everything from varying her speed to taking the exits that led to small towns along the route. Each attempt led to the same result. She would find herself back at mile marker 248 with the same fuel level, the same odometer reading, and the same sense of déjà vu. The exits seemed to lead to towns that were slightly different from what she remembered, with buildings in different locations and businesses that didn't match her previous knowledge of the area. When she tried to stop at a truck stop that she'd visited many times before, she found that the facility had a different layout and was staffed by people she'd never seen before. Rebecca's attempts to document her experience proved futile, as each loop reset not just her truck systems, but also her personal belongings. Notes she wrote would disappear, photos she took with her phone would vanish, and voice recordings she made would be erased when the loop reset. She began to suspect that she was trapped in some kind of temporal pocket, a bubble of space-time that existed outside the normal flow of reality. The highway had become a prison, and she was the only person who retained any memory of the repeating cycles. The knowledge that she was trapped in an endless loop of the same 60-mile stretch of highway was both terrifying and maddening. The breakthrough came during what Rebecca estimated to be her 40th loop through the same section of highway. She had begun to notice that certain elements of her environment were responsive to her thoughts and emotions. When she felt frustrated, the weather would turn stormy. When she felt hopeful, the sunrise would appear more beautiful than usual. When she felt angry, other vehicles would behave more aggressively around her. Rebecca realized that her mental state was somehow influencing the reality of the time loop, suggesting that her consciousness was more deeply connected to the phenomenon than she had initially understood. During her 47th loop, Rebecca made a decision that went against every instinct she'd developed as a professional driver. Instead of trying to escape the loop or fight against it, she decided to embrace the experience and see what lessons it might teach her. She began to pay attention to details she'd previously overlooked. The way the morning light played across the prairie grass, the patterns of wind that moved across the landscape, the subtle variations in the road's surface that told the story of decades of weather and traffic. She started to see the highway, not as a means of transportation, but as a living entity with its own consciousness and purpose. Rebecca's acceptance of her situation seemed to be the key to her eventual escape. During her 51st loop, she found herself genuinely grateful for the opportunity to experience the beauty of the South Dakota landscape in a way that no other drivers ever had. She had seen the same stretch of highway under dozens of different conditions, at different times of day, and in different seasons. She had witnessed the full spectrum of prairie weather and light. And she had come to understand the highway as a complex ecosystem rather than just a strip of asphalt. When she reached mile marker 248 on that 51st loop, she was surprised to see mile marker 249 appear in her headlights for the first time in hours. The experience of being trapped in the time loop changed Rebecca's entire approach to long-haul trucking. She had learned that the highways were more than just transportation infrastructure. They were spaces where consciousness and reality intersected in ways that science couldn't fully explain. The road had taught her that time and space were more fluid than she'd ever imagined, and that the journey was often more important than the destination. Rebecca completed her delivery to Portland without further incident. But she never forgot the lesson that Interstate 90 had taught her about the nature of reality and the hidden dimensions that existed within America's highway system. Carl Thompson had been hauling freight across America's highways for 25 years, building a reputation among dispatchers and brokers as one of the most reliable drivers in the business. His pristine 2018 Peterbilt 389 was a testament to his professionalism. Every chrome surface polished to a mirror finish, every mechanical component maintained with religious precision, and every logbook entry recorded with the accuracy of a man who took pride in doing things right. Carl specialized in high-value loads that required both security consciousness and impeccable timing, often running routes that other drivers found too demanding or stressful. On the night of January 23, 2024, Carl was hauling a load of medical equipment from Jacksonville to Atlanta, running his familiar route on Interstate 75 through the heart of Georgia, when he encountered something that would shatter his understanding of identity and reality in ways that no amount of driving experience could have prepared him for. Carl had departed Jacksonville at 10 p.m., timing his departure to arrive in Atlanta during the early morning hours when traffic was lightest, and unloading could proceed without the delays that plagued daytime deliveries. He'd been driving this particular route for over a decade, and he knew every mile marker, every truck stop, and every traffic pattern along the 346-mile stretch of I-75 that connected Florida's coast to Georgia's capital. The night was clear and cold, with visibility that stretched for miles in every direction. Perfect conditions for making good time while maintaining the fuel efficiency that had made Carl one of the most profitable owner-operators in the Southeast. At 1:17 a.m., Carl was passing through the rural stretches of South Georgia, running slightly ahead of schedule and enjoying the peaceful solitude that came with night driving. The first sign that something was wrong came when Carl noticed an unusual amount of activity on his CB radio. Normally, the airwaves were relatively quiet during the early morning hours, with only occasional transmissions from other night drivers sharing weather reports or traffic information. Tonight, however, the radio was buzzing with confused chatter from multiple drivers, all reporting the same bizarre phenomenon. "I'm seeing the same truck in 2 different places," one voice reported. "There's a Peterbilt 389 in the southbound lanes, and I swear I just saw the exact same truck in the northbound lanes. Same color, same configuration, even the same driver." Carl keyed his microphone to respond, but before he could speak, another voice cut in. "I'm seeing the same thing. There's definitely 2 identical Pete 389s running in opposite directions, and they both have the same guy behind the wheel." Carl felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the other drivers were describing his truck. He was indeed driving a Peterbilt 389, and he was currently in the southbound lanes of I-75, but he hadn't encountered any northbound traffic that matched his own vehicle. Carl decided to investigate by pulling over at the next rest area to get a better look at the northbound traffic. As he parked his truck and walked to the edge of the facility, he could see the headlights of northbound traffic approaching from the south. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, in the northbound lanes, was a truck that appeared to be identical to his own. Same model, same color scheme, same chrome configuration, and even the same custom lighting that Carl had installed to make his truck distinctive. More disturbing still, the driver appeared to be wearing the same clothing that Carl was wearing. And from a distance, the physical resemblance was unmistakable. Carl grabbed his binoculars from his truck and focused on the northbound Peterbilt as it passed the rest area. The driver was not just similar to Carl. It was Carl, down to the last detail. Same face, same hair, same posture behind the wheel, even the same way of holding the steering wheel that Carl had developed over decades of driving. The truck's license plate, company logos, and even the pattern of road grime on the trailer were identical to Carl's own rig. As the truck disappeared into the distance, Carl noticed that other drivers in the rest area were pointing and taking pictures, clearly aware that they were witnessing something impossible. The driver approached Carl and said, "Buddy, I just saw your truck going north while you're standing here." How the hell is that possible? Carl climbed back into his truck and resumed his journey. But the experience had left him deeply shaken. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen, considering explanations ranging from coincidence to some kind of elaborate prank. But nothing could account for the perfect duplication of every detail, including his own physical appearance. As he continued driving, the CB radio continued to crackle with reports from other drivers who were encountering the same phenomenon. "There's definitely 2 Carl Thompsons out here tonight," one voice reported. "I know Carl personally, and I just talked to him at the Valdosta truck stop. But I'm also seeing him in the southbound lanes right now." Carl keyed his microphone and identified himself. But the response from other drivers was immediate and disturbing. "Carl, I'm looking at you right now in the southbound lanes. But I also just saw you 20 minutes ago, heading north. Which one is the real Carl?" The question haunted Carl as he continued his journey toward Atlanta. He began to wonder if he was somehow experiencing a breakdown in reality, or if there was indeed another version of himself driving the highways of Georgia. The reports from other drivers were too consistent and detailed to be dismissed as misidentification or mass hallucination. Carl decided to test the situation by stopping at a truck stop, where he was well known to see if the staff could provide any insight into what was happening. He pulled into the Flying J in Tifton, a facility where he'd been stopping for fuel and meals for over 15 years. The night manager, a woman named Betty who had worked there for even longer than Carl had been driving, greeted him with a confused expression. "Carl, what are you doing back here?" "You were just here an hour ago, heading north with a load of electronics." Carl explained that he'd been driving south all night and hadn't stopped at this location in over a week. But Betty insisted that she'd seen him earlier in the evening. She even showed him the fuel receipt from the previous transaction, which bore his truck's number and his signature, but in handwriting that was slightly different from his own. The receipt was dated 2 hours earlier, during a time when Carl had been more than 100 miles away from Tifton. Betty called over another employee who confirmed that Carl had indeed been at the truck stop earlier, engaging in the same friendly conversation that he always had with the staff. "But you seemed a little different," the employee noted. "More quiet than usual, and you kept looking around like you were expecting someone." The revelation that his doppelganger was not just being seen by other drivers, but was actually interacting with people who knew Carl personally sent him into a spiral of confusion and fear. Carl realized that whatever was happening was more than just a visual phenomenon. There was apparently another version of himself that was living a parallel existence, making the same stops, following the same routes, and engaging with the same people. The implications were staggering. If there were 2 versions of Carl Thompson driving the highways of Georgia, which one was real? Carl began to question his own memories and experiences, wondering if he might be the duplicate rather than the original. As Carl continued toward Atlanta, he began to notice that his truck was behaving differently than usual. The engine sounded slightly off, with a minor vibration that he'd never experienced before. He'd start. The GPS was showing small discrepancies in his location, placing him a few hundred yards away from where he knew he actually was. Most disturbing of all, his CB radio was picking up transmissions that seemed to be coming from his own truck, as if he was somehow communicating with himself. Carl heard his own voice giving traffic reports, discussing fuel prices, and chatting with other drivers about weather conditions. The conversations were identical to ones that Carl remembered having, but they were happening in real time while he was listening to them. The climax came when Carl encountered his doppelganger directly. As he approached the outskirts of Atlanta, he crested a hill and saw in the distance a northbound truck that was unmistakably his own. As the two trucks approached each other, Carl could see that the other driver was indeed identical to himself in every detail. The moment of passing lasted only a few seconds, but during that time, Carl made eye contact with his duplicate. The other Carl appeared to be just as shocked and confused as he was, and both men turned to watch each other's trucks disappear into the distance. The experience was so surreal that Carl began to wonder if he was experiencing a complete mental breakdown, or if the highways of Georgia had somehow become a place where the laws of physics and identity no longer applied. Carl completed his delivery to Atlanta without further incident, but the experience of encountering his doppelganger had fundamentally changed his understanding of reality. He learned that the highways were more than just transportation infrastructure. They were spaces where the boundaries between possible and impossible became blurred. The road had shown him that identity itself was more fluid than he'd ever imagined, and that sometimes the person looking back at you from the mirror might not be the same person who started the journey. Carl never encountered his duplicate again, but he never forgot the lesson that Interstate 75 had taught him about the nature of self and the hidden dimensions that existed within America's highway system. Diana Martinez had been a hazmat-certified driver for 14 years, specializing in the transport of dangerous materials that required both extensive training and nerves of steel. Her 2017 Kenworth T680 was equipped with every safety system mandated by federal regulations, from advanced braking systems to emergency containment protocols, making her one of the most trusted drivers in the chemical transport industry. Diana had hauled everything from corrosive acids to radioactive isotopes, navigating the complex web of regulations and safety requirements that governed the movement of hazardous materials across America's highways. On the night of February 18th, 2024, Diana was hauling a load of industrial chemicals from Denver to Salt Lake City, running her usual route through the treacherous mountain passes of Colorado, when she encountered a way station that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the infrastructure that governed commercial trucking. Diana had departed Denver at 11 p.m., timing her departure to navigate the most dangerous sections of Interstate 70 during the early morning hours when traffic was lightest and weather conditions were most predictable. Her trailer was loaded with 40,000 pounds of various chemical compounds destined for a manufacturing facility in Utah. Each container properly labeled, secured, and documented according to Department of Transportation regulations. The hazmat endorsement on her commercial driver's license represented years of training and testing, and Diana took pride in her perfect safety record and her reputation for handling the most challenging loads in the industry. The night was clear and cold, with temperatures well below freezing, but the highway was dry and road conditions were ideal for maintaining the steady pace that hazmat loads required. At 3:17 a.m., Diana was climbing through the high mountain passes west of Denver when she encountered a way station that she'd never seen before. Despite having driven this route hundreds of times over the past decade, the facility appeared to be a standard commercial vehicle inspection station, with the familiar overhead signs directing trucks to enter for mandatory weight and safety checks. What surprised Diana was the location. She knew every way station along this corridor, and there hadn't been one at this particular spot during her last trip through the area just 2 weeks earlier. The station looked new, with fresh pavement, modern LED lighting, and state-of-the-art inspection equipment that suggested a recent construction project that she'd somehow missed hearing about in the industry publications she read religiously. Diana pulled her truck onto the scales as directed, following the standard procedure for hazmat loads that required additional documentation and inspection protocols. The weigh station was staffed by 2 officers wearing Colorado State Patrol uniforms, complete with the proper insignia and equipment that she'd expect from legitimate enforcement personnel. The first officer, whose name tag read Johnson, approached her driver's window with the professional demeanor of someone who'd been conducting commercial vehicle inspections for years. "Evening, driver. We're conducting a routine hazmat inspection tonight. I'll need to see your CDL, medical card, hazmat endorsement, and all shipping documentation." Diana handed over her credentials and paperwork, noting that Officer Johnson's uniform and badge appeared authentic in every detail. The inspection process was thorough and professional, with both officers demonstrating the kind of expertise that came from years of experience with hazmat regulations. They checked every aspect of Diana's load, from the proper placarding on her trailer to the emergency response information required for each type of chemical she was transporting. Officer Johnson's partner, identified as Williams, conducted a detailed examination of Diana's electronic logbook, verifying that her hours of service were in compliance with federal regulations. The inspection took nearly 40 minutes, which was longer than usual, but not unprecedented for a hazmat load. Throughout the process, both officers maintained the courteous but authoritative manner that Diana had come to expect from legitimate enforcement personnel. What began to trouble Diana was the unusual number of questions the officers asked about her route and destination. While safety inspections typically focused on the technical aspects of the load and the driver's qualifications, these officers seemed unusually interested in the specific chemicals she was carrying and their intended use at the manufacturing facility in Utah. Officer Williams asked detailed questions about the chemical processes that would be used with her cargo, questions that went far beyond the scope of a routine safety inspection. "Are you familiar with the specific industrial applications of these compounds?" Williams asked, referring to a clipboard that contained information about Diana's load that she hadn't provided. "We're conducting a special investigation into the transport of certain chemical combinations." Diana became increasingly uncomfortable as the inspection continued, particularly when she realized that the officers were asking questions that suggested they had access to information that wasn't contained in her shipping papers. They knew details about the chemical composition of her load that were classified as proprietary information by the shipper, and they seemed to understand the industrial processes that would be used with the chemicals better than most safety inspectors would. When Diana asked to see their identification again, both officers readily complied, producing credentials that appeared legitimate but contained subtle inconsistencies that troubled her. The badge numbers didn't follow the standard format she was familiar with, and the photographs on their identification cards seemed slightly off, as if they'd been altered or doctored. The situation became truly alarming when Diana noticed that the weigh station's computer systems were displaying information that couldn't possibly be accurate. The electronic scale showed her truck's weight as being exactly 80,000 pounds, which was the maximum legal limit, despite the fact that her actual loaded weight was closer to 75,000 pounds. The inspection computer displayed a driver history that included trips she'd never made and violations she'd never committed. Most disturbing of all, The system showed her as having been inspected at this same way station multiple times over the past year, despite the fact that she was certain this facility hadn't existed until tonight. When she pointed out these discrepancies to the officers, they dismissed her concerns with explanations that seemed plausible, but didn't address the fundamental impossibility of the data they were showing her. As the inspection dragged on, Diana began to notice other troubling details about the facility and its personnel. The way station building had no windows, which was unusual for a structure that was supposed to house administrative offices and break rooms for inspection personnel. The parking area was perfectly clean, with no evidence of the oil stains, tire marks, or general wear that would be expected from a facility that processed hundreds of commercial vehicles. Most unsettling of all, the officers' radios occasionally crackled with transmissions that seemed to be coming from dispatch centers that didn't exist, using call signs and procedures that didn't match standard law enforcement protocols. Diana heard references to project oversight and chemical route monitoring that suggested the inspection was part of some larger operation that went beyond routine safety enforcement. The climax came when Diana asked to contact her dispatcher to report the extended delay. Officer Johnson handed her a phone and told her to make the call. But when she dialed her company's number, she was connected to a voice that claimed to be her dispatcher, but knew details about her employment that the real dispatcher wouldn't have access to. The voice on the phone confirmed that Diana was authorized to carry her current load and instructed her to comply fully with the inspection. But the conversation felt scripted and artificial, as if she was talking to someone who was reading from a prepared script rather than engaging in genuine communication. When she asked the voice to confirm her dispatcher's identity by providing personal information that only he would know, the line went dead. Diana's growing sense of panic reached a breaking point when she noticed that the way station's clock displayed a time that didn't match her truck's chronometer or her cell phone. According to the facility's timepiece, she'd been at the way station for less than 15 minutes. But her own instruments showed that nearly 2 hours had passed since she'd entered the facility. The discrepancy was impossible to explain, and it suggested that the way station existed in some kind of temporal pocket that operated according to different rules than the outside world. When she pointed out this inconsistency to the officers, they seemed genuinely confused, as if they weren't aware of the time distortion that was affecting the facility. The inspection finally concluded with Officer Johnson declaring that Diana's load was approved for continued transport, but the experience had left her deeply shaken. As she prepared to leave the way station, she noticed that the facility's entrance and exit ramps seemed to lead directly back to Interstate 70, despite the fact that she remembered taking a more complex route to reach the scales. When she looked in her mirrors as she pulled back onto the highway, she was stunned to see that the way station had completely disappeared, leaving only an empty patch of mountainside where the facility had stood moments before. The pavement, lighting, and buildings had vanished without a trace, as if they'd never existed at all. Diana immediately pulled over at the next rest area and called her real dispatcher, confirming that the inspection delay had never been reported and that there was no record of her having been stopped by law enforcement. Her electronic logbook showed no indication of the extended stop, and her truck's GPS tracking system displayed a continuous record of movement along Interstate 70, with no deviation to a way station. The chemical load arrived in Salt Lake City on schedule, with no evidence that it had been inspected or tampered with during the journey. Diana's experience at the vanishing way station had taught her that the highways were monitored by entities that existed outside the normal framework of law enforcement, and that sometimes The most routine aspects of commercial trucking could become gateways to encounters with forces that operated beyond human understanding. Eddie Kowalski had been running cross-country freight for 18 years, specializing in the long desert hauls that connected California's ports to the distribution centers of Texas and the Southeast. His 2016 Freightliner Coronado was built for the punishing miles of interstate trucking. With a spacious sleeper cab that had become his home, away from home, during the weeks he spent on the road. Eddie prided himself on being a driver who could handle any route, any weather, and any deadline. But he'd always maintained one strict personal rule throughout his career: never pick up hitchhikers. The highways were full of people with stories he didn't want to hear and problems he couldn't solve. And Eddie had learned early that the safest policy was to keep his cab door locked and his eyes focused on the road ahead. On the night of March 2nd, 2024, Eddie was hauling a load of consumer electronics from Los Angeles to Houston, running his familiar route on Interstate 10 through the vast emptiness of the Arizona desert, when he encountered a hitchhiker who would force him to break his most fundamental rule and confront the possibility that not everyone seeking a ride was entirely human. Eddie had departed the port of Los Angeles at 8 p.m., timing his departure to cross the desert during the cooler nighttime hours when his truck's cooling system wouldn't be stressed by the extreme temperatures that plagued the region during daylight hours. His trailer was loaded with 45,000 pounds of televisions, computers, and smartphones destined for a major retailer's distribution center in Houston. Valuable cargo that required both security consciousness and precise climate control to prevent damage from temperature fluctuations. The night was clear and moonless, with the kind of star-filled sky that was only visible in the remote desert areas where light pollution hadn't yet reached. Eddie was making excellent time across the sparse landscape, running slightly ahead of schedule and enjoying the peaceful solitude that came with night driving through one of America's most desolate regions. At 2:34 a.m., Eddie was climbing the long grade east of Phoenix when his headlights illuminated a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway, thumb extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker seeking a ride. The person appeared to be a woman in her 30s, wearing jeans and a light jacket that seemed inadequate for the desert cold. What struck Eddie as unusual was her location. She was standing in the middle of nowhere, at least 50 miles from the nearest town, with no visible vehicle or explanation for how she had arrived at this remote spot. Eddie's first instinct was to follow his established policy and drive past without stopping. But something about the woman's posture and appearance made him reconsider. She wasn't frantically waving or displaying the desperate behavior that Eddie associated with people in genuine distress. Instead, she stood calmly beside the highway, as if she was confident that someone would eventually stop to help her. Eddie pulled his truck to the shoulder about 100 yards past the hitchhiker, wrestling with a decision that went against 18 years of road experience. The woman was alone in one of the most dangerous environments in North America, where daytime temperatures could reach lethal levels and nighttime cold could be equally deadly. The nearest town was hours away by foot, and Eddie knew that without shelter or transportation, the woman's chances of survival were minimal. Against his better judgment, Eddie decided to offer her a ride to the next truck stop, where she could find proper assistance or contact family members who could help her reach her destination safely. He activated his hazard lights and waited for the woman to approach his truck, noting that she moved with a confident stride that suggested she wasn't suffering from exhaustion or dehydration. The woman climbed into Eddie's passenger seat with a grace that seemed unusual for someone who had presumably been stranded in the desert for an extended period. She introduced herself as Maria, speaking with a slight accent that Eddie couldn't quite place, and thanked him for stopping to help her. When Eddie asked how she had ended up stranded on the highway, Maria's explanation was vague and inconsistent. She claimed that her car had broken down, but when Eddie asked about the vehicle, she couldn't provide details about its make, model, or current location. She said she'd been walking for hours, but her clothing showed no signs of dust or wear that would be expected from a desert hike. Most puzzling of all, Maria seemed to know details about Eddie's route and destination that he hadn't shared with her, casually mentioning truck stops and landmarks that lay hundreds of miles ahead. As Eddie resumed driving, he began to notice other unusual characteristics about his passenger. The cab's temperature seemed to drop significantly after Maria had climbed aboard, despite the fact that the heating system was functioning normally. The woman's skin appeared unnaturally pale in the dashboard lights, and Eddie noticed that she didn't seem to be breathing in the regular rhythm that would be expected from someone who had been walking in the desert. Most disturbing of all, when Eddie glanced in his rearview mirror, he couldn't see Maria's reflection, despite the fact that she was clearly sitting in the passenger seat. The phenomenon was so unsettling that Eddie pulled over at the next rest area to check his mirrors and confirm that they were functioning properly. During the stop, Maria remained in the truck while Eddie performed a walk-around inspection, ostensibly checking his tires and cargo, but actually trying to understand what was happening to his passenger. When he looked through the truck's windows from the outside, he could see Maria sitting in the passenger seat. But her image seemed somehow insubstantial, as if she was a projection or hologram rather than a physical person. Eddie climbed back into the cab and tried to engage Maria in conversation, asking about her family, her destination, and her plans for getting home. Her answers were increasingly evasive and contradictory, and Eddie began to suspect that she was suffering from some kind of mental health crisis or drug-induced confusion. The situation became truly alarming when Maria began to demonstrate knowledge about Eddie's personal life that she couldn't possibly possess. She mentioned his ex-wife by name, described his childhood home in Ohio with perfect accuracy, and even knew about a trucking accident he'd been involved in 5 years earlier that had never been reported in any public records. "You've been carrying guilt about that accident for too long, Eddie," Maria said, her voice taking on an ethereal quality that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical confines of the truck cab. "The other driver wasn't hurt as badly as you thought, and the insurance company's decision wasn't your fault." Eddie had never spoken to anyone about the emotional burden he'd carried from that accident, and Maria's knowledge of the incident was both comforting and terrifying. As the night progressed, Eddie began to realize that Maria wasn't simply a stranded hitchhiker. She was something else entirely, perhaps a spiritual entity or psychological manifestation that had taken human form. She seemed to exist at the intersection of Eddie's consciousness and the mystical forces that operated in the desert's vast emptiness. The woman's presence was both comforting and unsettling, offering insights into Eddie's life and career that helped him understand aspects of his own personality that he'd never fully examined. Maria spoke about the loneliness of long-haul trucking, the sacrifices that drivers made for their profession, and the spiritual significance of the highways that connected America's communities. The climax came when Eddie realized that Maria was slowly fading away, becoming less substantial with each passing mile. Her voice grew softer and more distant, and her physical form seemed to be dissolving into the desert air that flowed through the truck's ventilation system. "Thank you for stopping, Eddie," she said, her words barely audible above the sound of the engine. Not many drivers would have taken the risk of helping a stranger in the middle of nowhere. "Your kindness has been noted, and it will be remembered. Eddie turned to respond, but the passenger seat was empty, with no sign that anyone had been sitting there. The cab's temperature returned to normal, and Eddie's mirrors once again showed only his own reflection. Eddie completed his delivery to Houston without further incident. But the experience with Maria had fundamentally changed his understanding of the highways he traveled. He learned that the desert roads were more than just transportation corridors. They were spaces where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds became thin, allowing encounters with entities that existed beyond normal human experience. The road had taught him that sometimes the most important cargo a driver could carry was compassion for fellow travelers, regardless of their nature or origin. Eddie never again refused to help someone in need, understanding that the highways were places where human kindness could bridge the gap between worlds, and that every act of generosity had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Frank Morrison had been driving long-haul freight for 6 years, representing a new generation of truckers who relied heavily on modern technology to navigate America's increasingly complex highway system. His 2019 Peterbilt 579 was equipped with the latest GPS navigation systems, electronic logbooks, and fleet management software that allowed him to optimize his routes for maximum efficiency and minimum fuel consumption. Frank prided himself on being a tech-savvy driver who could adapt to the digital transformation of the trucking industry. Using smartphone apps to find the cheapest fuel, route optimization software to avoid traffic congestion, and real-time weather data to make informed decisions about his travel plans. On the night of April 14th, 2024, Frank was hauling a load of furniture from North Carolina to Boston, running his usual route on the Interstate 95 through the rural stretches of Virginia, when his GPS system would lead him into a nightmare that challenged his faith in the technology that had become his most trusted companion on the road. Frank had departed Charlotte at 9 p.m., timing his departure to reach the congested corridors around Washington, D.C., during the early morning hours when traffic was lightest and his delivery schedule could be maintained without the delays that plagued daytime travel. His trailer was loaded with 42,000 pounds of bedroom furniture destined for a major retailer's distribution center in Massachusetts. Cargo that required careful handling, but presented no special challenges in terms of hazardous materials or time-sensitive delivery windows. The night was clear and cool, with perfect visibility that allowed Frank to maintain his preferred cruising speed of 65 miles per hour, while monitoring his fuel consumption through the advanced dashboard displays that provided real-time data about every aspect of his truck's performance. At 11:47 p.m., Frank was approaching the rural sections of Virginia south of Richmond when his primary GPS unit began displaying an unusual message about traffic congestion ahead. The system indicated that a major accident was blocking all lanes of Interstate 95, with estimated delays of 3 to 4 hours. Frank's backup navigation system confirmed the alert, and both units recommended the same alternate route, a series of state highways that would bypass the congestion and reconnect with I-95 north of the affected area. Frank had encountered similar situations before, and he trusted his navigation systems to guide him around the obstacle efficiently. He took the recommended exit and began following the electronic voice commands that directed him onto what appeared to be a well-maintained state highway running parallel to the interstate. The detour initially seemed routine, with Frank following a series of turns and route changes that his GPS systems presented as the optimal path around the traffic congestion. The roads were properly marked with standard highway signs, and the pavement quality was consistent with what Frank expected from Virginia's state highway system. What began to trouble him was the length of the detour. After nearly an hour of following GPS directions, he should have been reconnecting with Interstate 95. But instead, he found himself on increasingly remote roads that seemed to be leading him deeper into rural Virginia rather than back toward his original route. Frank checked his position on both navigation systems and discovered that they were showing conflicting information about his location, with one system placing him near the town of Farmville and the other indicating that he was somewhere near the North Carolina border. Frank pulled over at what appeared to be a small country store to check his paper maps and verify his position using traditional navigation methods. The store was closed, but the exterior lighting allowed him to examine his atlas and compare it to the electronic displays in his truck. What he discovered was deeply troubling. The roads he had been traveling didn't appear on his paper maps, and the towns his GPS systems claimed he was near weren't located in the positions the electronic systems indicated. Most disturbing of all, when Frank tried to use his smartphone to verify his location, the device showed no GPS signal and no cellular coverage, despite the fact that he was supposedly in an area with good infrastructure coverage according to his carrier's coverage maps. As Frank resumed driving, following what he hoped were directions back to Interstate 95, he began to encounter other commercial vehicles that appeared to be in similar situations. A convoy of 3 trucks was parked at a rural intersection, their drivers standing outside their cabs and examining maps under the glow of their flashlights. Frank pulled over to join them and discovered that all 3 drivers were experiencing the same problem. Their GPS systems had directed them away from their intended routes and into a maze of rural roads that didn't seem to connect to any major highways. One driver, a veteran hauler named Pete, had been trying to reach Interstate 81 for over 2 hours. Another, a woman named Sarah, had been attempting to return to Interstate 64, but found herself progressively more lost with each turn her navigation system recommended. The 4 drivers compared their GPS displays and discovered that each system was showing different maps of the same area, with roads, towns, and landmarks positioned in configurations that contradicted each other. Frank's primary GPS showed a direct route back to I-95 that required only 3 more turns. But Pete's system indicated that the same roads would lead to a dead end. Sarah's navigation unit displayed a completely different road network, with highways and intersections that didn't match what any of the other systems showed. Most unsettling of all, when the drivers tried to correlate their electronic maps with their paper atlases, they found that the roads they were currently traveling didn't appear on any traditional map, despite the fact that they were clearly well-established highways with proper signage and maintenance. Frank decided to lead the convoy of lost drivers in what he hoped would be a systematic approach to finding their way back to the interstate system. Using his paper maps as a reference, he plotted a course that should have taken them east toward Interstate 95. But after an hour of driving on roads that seemed to curve and twist in ways that defied the straight-line geometry of Virginia's rural highway system, they found themselves at the exact same intersection where they had started. The impossibility of the situation was undeniable. They had driven in what their odometers confirmed was a large circle, but their GPS systems showed them as having traveled in a straight line for over 50 miles. The nightmare deepened when Frank realized that the landscape around them was changing in subtle but disturbing ways. Buildings that had been on the right side of the road were now on the left, and farmhouses that had been dark during their first pass were now showing lights in windows that suggested occupancy. Most troubling of all, the road signs were displaying different town names and distances than they had shown an hour earlier, as if the entire region was rearranging itself to prevent the drivers from finding their way back to familiar territory. Frank's fuel gauge was showing a steady decrease, despite the fact that they seemed to be covering the same ground repeatedly, and his engine temperature was rising as if the truck was working harder than the terrain demanded. The breakthrough came when Frank decided to abandon his electronic navigation systems entirely and rely on traditional wayfinding techniques that older drivers had used before GPS technology became available. He began following the North Star, using the natural navigation methods that had guided travelers for centuries. And gradually the convoy began to make progress toward what appeared to be a major highway. As they approached the familiar glow of interstate lighting, Frank's GPS systems suddenly sprang back to life, showing their correct position and providing accurate directions to their original destinations. The roads they had been traveling for the past 4 hours were no longer visible on any of their maps, electronic or paper, as if they had been erased from existence. Frank completed his delivery to Boston without further incident. But the experience of being lost in Virginia's Phantom Road network had fundamentally changed his relationship with the technology he had once trusted implicitly. He learned that the highways existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, with electronic systems sometimes accessing road networks that belonged to different versions of reality. The experience taught him that the most advanced technology was no substitute for human intuition and traditional navigation skills, and that sometimes the roads that appeared on GPS screens led to places that weren't meant to be found by travelers who relied too heavily on artificial intelligence to guide their journeys through America's increasingly complex transportation system. Grace Larkin had always preferred the night shift. For her, there was a meditative quality to the long hours spent behind the wheel. Headlights carving tunnels through darkness, radio murmuring softly in the background. After 16 years as a professional truck driver, she had come to trust her instincts more than technology, especially after the strange things she'd seen crossing America's loneliest roads. Her midnight run on July 3rd, 2024, was supposed to be routine. Hauling a load of auto parts from St. Louis to Denver on Interstate 70, slicing through the silent heartland with nothing but the highway and her thoughts for company. What she found on that endless Kansas straightaway would challenge her understanding of what lingered just out of sight. The night was clear and suffocatingly still. One of those Kansas nights where the flat land seemed more like an ocean than a prairie, and silence pressed in on Grace's truck until even her engine sounded muted. She'd just passed Selena when it began. A flicker of movement in her side mirror, a shimmer she could have blamed on exhaustion if it hadn't persisted. Glancing at the mirror, she caught a peculiar sight. Headlights, 3 pairs, clustered far too close together, trailing behind her like shadows. Yet, when she leaned toward her window and looked directly back, the highway was empty, the horizon unbroken, except for the thin white line of moonlight on asphalt. Grace felt her pulse quicken. She toggled her mirror's adjuster, thinking perhaps a reflection from the rigs passing eastbound in the opposite lane had tricked her. But when she looked forward, the eastbound highway was empty too. The 3 trucks behind her, she could see their shapes now, just barely, remained visible only in the glass. Grace reached for her CB radio, her tone even but tight. Westbound mile marker 312. Anybody else see a convoy behind me? The airwaves replied with nothing but distant static and a lone, mumbled greeting from a driver many miles away. The convoy grew. 4 trucks, then 5, each rig luminous in silver moonlight, lights glowing but never dazzling. Their grillwork and side mirrors sparkled in her mirror, and she could even make out the silhouettes of drivers, faces hidden in darkness. Every time Grace looked directly, the rear view showed only the honest solitude of her own taillights. But in the mirror, the procession stretched for what had to be half a mile, unbroken and inexplicably, impossibly real. She accelerated, pushing her truck to 70, then 75, so far above her usual cautious pace that the engine whined in protest. The trucks behind kept perfect pace, never overtaking, never falling back. Checking her side mirrors, she caught new details. Faded company logos she almost recognized from old trucking outfits that had gone bust years ago. Banged-up cabs with outdated DOT numbers. And, strangest of all, one tanker trailer with a hand-painted slogan that famously vanished after a notorious hazmat accident in the late 90s. Grace felt a sweat break out under her collar. Odd tales and highway urban legends came to mind. Phantom trucks, convoys of lost drivers. But those were campfire stories, not reality. Near mile marker 330, she spotted a service plaza ahead, the first since the convoy had appeared. She signaled and eased off the highway, tires crunching onto the gravel entry. Looking back, nothing followed her. The parking lot lights glinted on a couple of parked sedans and a refrigerated van. But the highway remained quiet, no sign of a convoy or even a single rig that resembled those she'd seen in the mirror. Inside the 24-hour diner, Grace poured herself bad coffee and tried to gather her thoughts. She asked a pair of drivers if they'd seen a westbound convoy, but was met with confusion and polite shrugs. There had been little traffic, they said, much less a line of trucks riding bumper to bumper. Before heading back to her truck, she washed her face in the restroom, replaying years of stories told by old-timers about ghostly motorists, phantom loads, the kinds of things you only see in a reflection. Back on the road, Grace steadied herself, determined to finish her run and, if necessary, blame what she'd seen on stress. For 20 minutes, the drive was routine. Then, as she crossed a lonely section between exits, she caught movement in the mirror again. The convoy was back, this time closer, as though they'd only paused for her break. She pressed her eyes shut, looked out the side window, saw nothing. But in the mirror, the ghost trucks hummed along behind her, now with their turn signals blinking in a slow, rhythmic sync. Her radio crackled. A gravelly voice, barely audible, floated through the static. "Grace, you see us, don't you?" Her hands went cold. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the voice only replied with a low, almost tired laugh. "We ride the night. Only a few ever look back the right way. Want to join the convoy, Grace?" More voices, muted, overlapping, as though truckers from generations past had picked up their mics after all this time, murmured her name. Grace's mouth went dry. "No thanks," she said, voice barely above a whisper. She switched the radio off, heart pounding. Over the next 10 miles, the highway curved through a series of shallow hills, and the lights in her mirror slowly faded, one by one, until only darkness returned. By dawn, exhausted but resolute, Grace rolled into Denver. As she climbed down from the cab, she caught her reflection in the side mirror. For just a moment, she thought she saw not only herself, but a dozen drivers standing behind her, faces distant, watching through the glass. She never told the company dispatcher what happened that night, but she did share the story at the next truck stop, where an older driver nodded grimly and said, "You glanced into the convoy of shadows. Some say they're the lost. Some say they choose one of us every year to join them. Doesn't matter. Just keep your eyes on the road, and don't look too long in the mirrors after midnight." From then on, Grace made a habit of glancing back less often, and drove with the intuition that not every reflection is meant for us to see. she'd learned there are parts of the road that belong to the living and others that belong to those forever riding just out of sight, visible only in polished glass and moonlit dreams. If the price of the night shift was seeing more than she bargained for, Grace showed up for work just the same, her headlights cutting through the dark, tracing the thin, uncertain line between the world we know and the one riding silently, eternally just behind us. Henry Blackwood had been planning fuel-efficient routes for 22 years, developing an almost mathematical approach to long-haul trucking that had made him one of the most profitable owner-operators in the western states. His 2017 Kenworth T880 was equipped with every fuel-saving device available. Aerodynamic fairings, low rolling resistance tires, and engine programming that maximized efficiency at the expense of raw power. Henry could calculate fuel consumption down to the tenth of a gallon, plan routes that avoided unnecessary elevation changes, and time his stops to take advantage of the cheapest fuel prices across multiple states. His reputation among freight brokers was built on his ability to deliver loads with profit margins that other drivers couldn't match, a skill that had allowed him to build a comfortable nest egg after more than 2 decades on the road. On the night of May 7th, 2024, Henry was hauling a load of consumer goods from Sacramento to Phoenix, running a carefully calculated route through the Nevada desert that would minimize fuel costs while maintaining his delivery schedule, when he encountered a truck stop that would trap him in a nightmare that challenged everything he thought he knew about the economics of survival. Henry had departed Sacramento at 6 p.m., timing his departure to cross the desert during the cooler nighttime hours when his truck's engine would operate at peak efficiency. His trailer was loaded with 44,000 pounds of household goods destined for a major retailer's distribution center in Arizona. Cargo that presented no special challenges but required precise timing to meet the narrow delivery window that his contract demanded. Henry had plotted his route to take advantage of a fuel stop in remote Nevada, where diesel prices were typically 15 cents per gallon below the national average, a savings that would add nearly $40 to his profit margin for the trip. The facility was located on a lonely stretch of highway that most drivers avoided. But Henry had been stopping there for over 3 years, and the savings had been consistent enough to justify the slight detour from the main freight corridors. At 4:17 a.m., Henry's GPS indicated that he was approaching the truck stop, and he began the process of downshifting and reducing speed that would allow him to exit the highway efficiently. The facility appeared exactly as he remembered it. A small but well-maintained travel center with 4 fuel islands, a convenience store, and a parking area that could accommodate about 20 trucks. What surprised Henry was how busy the facility seemed to be, with nearly every parking space occupied by commercial vehicles, despite the early hour and remote location. Henry had never seen more than 5 or 6 trucks at this location during his previous visits, and the sudden increase in traffic suggested that other drivers had discovered the fuel savings that Henry had been quietly enjoying for years. Henry pulled up to the fuel islands and began the routine of topping off his tanks, checking his oil level, and performing the walk-around inspection that was second nature after more than 2 decades of professional driving. The fuel price displayed on the pump was even better than he'd expected, nearly 20 cents below the national average, a savings that would significantly improve his profit margin for the trip. As he was fueling, Henry noticed that the other drivers in the facility seemed unusually subdued, going about their business with a mechanical precision that suggested they were following well-established routines rather than making the spontaneous decisions that characterized most truck stop interactions. The atmosphere was quiet in a way that seemed unnatural for a busy truck stop, with none of the usual chatter, laughter, or complaints that Henry associated with drivers taking their mandatory rest breaks. After completing his fuel purchase, Henry decided to grab a cup of coffee and a snack from the convenience store before continuing his journey to Phoenix. The store was surprisingly well stocked for such a remote location, with hot food options, a wide selection of trucking supplies, and even a small seating area where drivers could eat and socialize. Behind the counter was a clerk who appeared to be in his 40s, wearing a name tag that read Dave, and greeting customers with a professional smile that seemed somehow forced or rehearsed. "Good morning, driver," Dave said as Henry approached the counter with his coffee and a sandwich. "How's the road treating you today?" Henry replied with his usual pleasantries, but something about Dave's demeanor troubled him. The man's eyes seemed to lack the warmth that his smile suggested, and his movements had an artificial quality that reminded Henry of someone following a script rather than engaging in genuine conversation. As Henry paid for his purchases, he noticed that Dave's hands were unnaturally cold when their fingers briefly touched during the transaction. The clerk's skin had an odd texture, almost waxy, and Henry could have sworn that he saw Dave's reflection in the security mirror behind the counter, showing a completely different person. Someone with darker hair, different facial features, and clothing that didn't match what Dave was actually wearing. Henry shook his head, attributing the strange observation to fatigue and the disorienting effects of night driving. But the image lingered in his mind as he walked back toward his truck. Henry encountered his first real indication that something was wrong when he tried to leave the facility. His truck started normally, all systems showed green, and he had plenty of fuel for the remaining miles to Phoenix. However, when he attempted to pull out of the parking area and return to the highway, he found that the exit road seemed to curve in an impossible direction, leading him in a wide circle that brought him right back to the same parking spot he'd just vacated. Henry tried again, this time paying careful attention to his GPS and compass heading, but the result was identical. No matter which direction he turned, he found himself back at the truck stop. The GPS showed him moving in a straight line away from the facility, but his physical location remained unchanged, as if the truck stop existed in a pocket of space that was disconnected from the normal highway system. Growing increasingly frustrated, Henry parked his truck and walked over to a group of drivers who were standing near the fuel islands, discussing what appeared to be mechanical problems with their vehicles. When Henry approached and explained his situation, the other drivers exchanged knowing looks that suggested they were familiar with the phenomenon he was describing. "First time trying to leave?" asked a driver named Bob, whose weathered face and tired eyes suggested he'd been dealing with this situation for longer than he cared to admit. "We've all been through the same thing. The road just brings you back here, no matter what you do." Henry looked around at the other drivers and began to notice details that he'd missed earlier. Their clothes were dusty and worn, their hair was longer than would be typical for drivers who maintained regular schedules, and their trucks showed signs of extended use without proper maintenance. Bob explained that he'd been trying to leave the truck stop for 6 months, ever since he'd stopped for fuel during a run from Denver to Las Vegas. Other drivers had been there even longer, some claiming to have been trapped for over a year, surviving on the food and supplies available in the convenience store while their trucks slowly deteriorated from lack of proper maintenance. The facility seemed to provide just enough resources to keep the trapped drivers alive, but never enough to allow them to escape or contact the outside world. Cell phones had no signal, CB radios couldn't reach beyond the immediate area, and satellite communication systems showed no available coverage. The truck stop had become a prison, and the drivers were its unwilling inmates. Henry's horror deepened when he realized that the other drivers were slowly changing, becoming more like the facility's staff with each passing day. Their personalities were becoming more subdued, their conversations more repetitive, and their behavior more mechanical. Some of the drivers who'd been there the longest seemed to have lost interest in escape entirely, content to perform the same routines day after day without questioning their situation. Henry noticed that Dave, the clerk behind the counter, had the same tired eyes and weathered appearance as the long-term prisoners, suggesting that he might have once been a driver himself before becoming part of the facility's permanent staff. The most disturbing discovery came when Henry realized that the truck stop existed in a temporal bubble, where time moved differently than in the outside world. His truck's clock showed that he'd been at the facility for several hours. But the sun never rose, the temperature never changed, and the other drivers insisted that it was always 4 a.m. at the truck stop. Henry's logbook should have been recording his time at the facility, but the electronic system showed no indication that he'd stopped, as if the truck stop existed outside the normal flow of time and space. His fuel gauge hadn't moved despite hours of engine operation, and his odometer showed no additional miles despite his repeated attempts to leave the facility. Henry spent what felt like days exploring every aspect of the truck stop, searching for weaknesses in whatever force was holding him prisoner. He examined the facility's electrical systems, looking for equipment that might be generating some kind of field that prevented escape. He studied the other drivers, trying to understand the process by which they were being transformed into compliant prisoners. He even attempted to damage the facility's infrastructure, hoping that disrupting its operations might weaken its hold on the trapped drivers. Nothing worked. The truck stop seemed to be powered by forces that operated beyond human understanding, and the drivers were helpless to resist its influence. The turning point came when Henry realized that the truck stop fed on despair and resignation. The drivers who had given up hope of escape were the ones who became most like the facility's staff, while those who maintained their determination to leave retained more of their humanity. Henry began to organize the other drivers, encouraging them to work together to find a way out of their prison. He shared his knowledge of fuel efficiency and route planning, helping other drivers optimize their trucks for what might be a desperate escape attempt. Most importantly, he refused to accept the facility's apparent permanence, insisting that there had to be a way to break free from its influence. Henry's breakthrough came when he realized that the truck stop's power was strongest during the artificial 4 a.m. hour that it maintained, but weakened slightly during the brief moments when the facility's systems reset themselves. During these microsecond intervals, the exit roads would briefly connect to the real highway system, offering a narrow window for escape. Henry had to time his departure perfectly, gunning his engine at exactly the right moment to slip through the gap between the truck stop's reality and the outside world. The escape was successful, but it came at a cost. Henry had to leave behind the drivers who were too far gone to make the attempt, understanding that they would remain trapped in the facility's endless 4 a.m. until they became part of its permanent staff. Henry completed his delivery to Phoenix and immediately contacted authorities about the trapped drivers. But when investigators searched the location, they found only an empty stretch of desert highway with no evidence that a truck stop had ever existed there. Henry's experience had taught him that the highway system contained facilities that existed outside normal reality, places where the economics of survival were governed by forces that no amount of fuel efficiency or route planning could overcome. The road had shown him that sometimes the best deal was too good to be true, and that the cheapest fuel could come at a price that no driver should ever have to pay. Marcus Hendricks had been hauling freight across America's highways for 23 years, building a reputation as one of the most dependable drivers in the long-haul industry. His 2014 Peterbilt 379 was a classic beauty that he'd maintained with obsessive care. Every chrome surface polished to perfection, every mechanical component serviced according to a schedule that would have impressed military logistics officers. Marcus had seen every kind of load, driven every major route, and weathered every challenge that the trucking industry could throw at a professional driver. He'd survived economic downturns, regulatory changes, and the technological revolution that had transformed the business he'd entered as a young man, with nothing but determination and a commercial driver's license. On the morning of August 15th, 2024, Marcus was completing what he believed would be his final run before retirement, hauling a mysterious load from Las Vegas to an address in the Nevada desert that didn't appear on any map. When he encountered a delivery destination that would force him to confront the ultimate boundary between life and death. Marcus had received the assignment through a freight broker he'd never worked with before. A man named Sullivan, who'd contacted him directly with an offer that was too lucrative to refuse. The load was classified as specialized transport, with a rate of $5 per mile and a delivery deadline that seemed almost impossibly tight. The pickup location was a warehouse in an industrial district of Las Vegas, and the destination was listed as a set of coordinates in the middle of the Nevada desert, approximately 200 miles northwest of the city. Sullivan had been vague about the nature of the cargo, describing it only as extremely sensitive materials that required absolute discretion and perfect timing. The broker had paid Marcus's fee in advance, transferring the money to his account with an efficiency that suggested serious financial backing and legitimate business operations. The pickup had been routine, with Marcus arriving at the warehouse at the specified time to find a sealed 53-foot trailer already loaded and ready for transport. The warehouse staff had been professional but strangely subdued, providing him with paperwork that listed the cargo as research materials, without specifying the nature of the research or the identity of the receiving party. What troubled Marcus was the unusual security surrounding the operation. Armed guards, surveillance cameras, and electronic monitoring equipment that seemed excessive for a standard freight delivery. The trailer itself was equipped with tracking devices and climate control systems that were more sophisticated than anything Marcus had seen in his decades of experience with specialized cargo. Marcus had departed Las Vegas at 11 p.m., following the GPS coordinates that Sullivan had provided and expecting to reach the delivery location sometime before dawn. The route took him northwest through the desert on increasingly remote highways, past landscapes that seemed to grow more desolate with each passing mile. The night was clear and cold, with a star-filled sky that provided the only illumination beyond his headlights. Marcus had driven through this region many times over the years, but the specific route he was following seemed to lead through areas he'd never seen before, despite his extensive knowledge of Nevada's highway system. The roads were well maintained but unmarked, with no signs indicating destinations or distances, as if they existed outside the normal infrastructure of the state highway system. At 3:47 a.m., Marcus's GPS indicated that he was approaching the delivery coordinates, but instead of finding a warehouse, research facility, or any other type of industrial building, he found himself driving through what appeared to be an ancient cemetery. The headstones were weathered and tilted, some dating back to the 1800s, arranged in neat rows that stretched across the desert floor as far as his headlights could reach. The access road was paved but narrow, barely wide enough for his truck and trailer, and it seemed to wind through the cemetery without any apparent destination. Marcus checked his GPS multiple times, confirming that he was at the correct coordinates. But there was no sign of any facility that could receive a commercial delivery. As Marcus drove deeper into the cemetery, his truck's electrical systems began to malfunction in ways that he'd never experienced before. The dashboard lights flickered, the radio produced only static, and the engine temperature gauge showed readings that fluctuated wildly despite the fact that the cooling system was operating normally. Most disturbing of all, Marcus began to see figures moving between the headstones. Not the distinct shapes of living people, but translucent forms that seemed to drift rather than walk. The figures appeared to be aware of his presence, turning to watch his truck pass and sometimes following alongside the trailer as if they were interested in the cargo he was carrying. The delivery location, when Marcus finally found it, was unlike anything he'd encountered in his 23 years of commercial driving. It was a loading dock that appeared to be built into the side of a hillside, with no visible building or structure above ground level. The dock was illuminated by lights that cast no shadows, and it was staffed by figures in dark uniforms who moved with the mechanical precision of people following well-rehearsed procedures. Marcus backed his trailer up to the dock, following the hand signals of a supervisor who communicated only through gestures, never speaking or making eye contact. The unloading process was swift and efficient, with the uniformed figures transferring the cargo to vehicles that looked like hearses, long black cars with tinted windows and specialized equipment for transporting what appeared to be human remains. As the unloading progressed, Marcus began to realize that the cargo he'd been transporting was not research materials or industrial equipment, but rather something far more disturbing. The containers being removed from his trailer were clearly designed for human transport, with life support systems and monitoring equipment that suggested they contained living or recently deceased occupants. The uniformed figures handled the containers with the reverence typically reserved for funeral services, and Marcus could hear what sounded like prayers or incantations being spoken in languages he didn't recognize. The supervisor approached Marcus with a clipboard and indicated that he should sign documents confirming the delivery. But when Marcus looked at the paperwork, he discovered that it was written in symbols and characters that bore no resemblance to any human language. The nightmare deepened when Marcus realized that his truck's odometer had stopped advancing, despite the fact that he'd been driving for hours. His fuel gauge showed no change from when he'd started the journey, and his electronic logbook displayed no record of the trip he'd just completed. Most terrifying of all, when Marcus looked at his watch, he discovered that it was still 11 p.m., the same time he'd departed Las Vegas. The delivery location existed outside normal time and space, and Marcus was trapped in a temporal loop that prevented him from leaving or returning to the world of the living. The uniformed figures seemed to be aware of his predicament, but they continued their work without acknowledging his growing panic. Marcus's attempts to communicate with the figures were met with silence, but he gradually began to understand that they were not entirely human. Their movements were too fluid, their coordination too perfect, and their faces, when he caught glimpses of them beneath their uniform caps, and had features that seemed to shift and change like smoke. The supervisor, who had been directing the unloading operation, finally approached Marcus and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. "You have delivered them safely," the figure said, its words carrying the weight of finality. "The passage is complete, and the boundary has been crossed. Your service to the living is ended, and your service to the dead has begun." Marcus realized that he had been recruited to transport souls from the world of the living to whatever realm lay beyond death. The cargo he'd been carrying consisted of people who had died, but whose spirits had not yet found their way to the afterlife. His role as a trucker had been expanded to include ferry service between dimensions, and the cemetery where he'd made the delivery was a way station where the dead gathered before continuing their journey to whatever lay beyond. The uniformed figures were guides who helped the deceased navigate the transition from life to death. And Marcus had become part of their operation, whether he'd chosen to or not. The supervisor explained that Marcus's truck would now be used to transport souls along routes that existed outside normal space and time. He would drive highways that connected the world of the living to the realm of the dead, picking up passengers who were ready to move on and delivering them to destinations that existed beyond human understanding. The work would be eternal, with no retirement, no rest, and no return to the life he'd known. Marcus had unknowingly signed a contract that bound him to service in the afterlife, and the payment he'd received was not money, but passage to existence that transcended the physical world. As dawn approached, Marcus felt his connection to the living world growing weaker. His memories of his previous life began to fade, replaced by knowledge of routes that led through dimensions where the laws of physics didn't apply. His truck transformed into something that could travel between worlds, and his understanding of cargo expanded to include the intangible essence of human souls. The cemetery around him became a transportation hub, where the dead gathered before continuing their journey, and Marcus became one of the drivers who helped them reach their final destination. Marcus's final run had indeed been his last as a living man, but it was also his first as a guide for the dead. He had learned that the highways connected more than just cities and states. They connected the world of the living to the realm of the dead. And some drivers were chosen to serve as ferrymen for souls making the ultimate journey. The road had claimed him not through accident or illness, but through a calling that transcended his mortal existence, making him part of an eternal convoy that carried the most precious cargo of all, the spirits of those who had completed their earthly journey and were ready to discover what lay beyond.